and welcome to Quid Pros Quo. I'm Rin.
And I'm Zac.
And today we are joined by my friend and writing group partner, Will Cornell. Will, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, yeah. I'm a fantasy author, writer right now, I guess, author in the future. Like Rin said, I've been with them in a writing group for about 2 years. Mostly I focus on writing fantasy, though some of my short stories do go into horror. I'm trying to get into rock climbing, so that's not writing and typing in a room, but that's a little bit about me.
Oh my goodness, rock
Sounds
climbing's
super
so
fun.
fun. So Will is releasing his debut novel this year at the end of the year. Will, do you have an exact date for that or a month?
Projecting November, towards the end of November.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So November 2024. And that's very exciting. It's called When the World Spoke. I just finished beta reading it. But one of the themes in When the World Spoke is like religion. One of the characters is a priest. So we have Will on today to talk about religion and fantasy, and this will be a 2-part episode. So over the next 2 weeks, he's going to talk about generally writing religion and fantasy, and how you can like handle that in a appropriate, sensitive way, as well as questions about his book and religion and his experience with writing, not like religious fan. Would you call it religious fantasy?
I would say so. A religious fantasy.
Okay, yeah. So his experience with writing religious fantasy. Yeah. Let's dive right into the questions. Zac, do you want to start us off?
Oh, yes, I would love to. So, Will, a lot of times when we read fantasy stories, it seems like a lot of authors omit religion when they're talking about the world building and the culture of the characters that are in the story or some of the cultures that we visit as we're traveling around the world. So walk us through a couple of the things that you do to design a religion for a fantasy setting.
Yeah, I don't know if when I designed the culture of my current book, I really did that separate from the religion. The religion kind of was the culture, if that makes sense. So designing it for this fantasy world, I wanted to have beliefs and practices. And I think that's where a lot of books that I read kind of stop in their religious world building. But beyond that, I want to take the next step is what is the impact personally in the characters? And this is what I think, like Rin said, makes this kind of a religious fantasy. It's not kind of a side piece. It's kind of in the forefront. It's one of the main events. But doing that, I wanted to have a character that one of their main tracks of development was actually kind of engaging with the religion. What did they believe when we started the book? What are some challenges that they face along the way with kind of engaging with their religious beliefs, with their church? And then where do they end up? So, I basically established those beliefs, established those practices, and saw how they impacted my character, essentially.
Yeah.
Cool.
Go ahead.
Could you talk to us a little bit about kind of the process that you go through for doing that? As far as, do you normally start with the beliefs? Do you start with the rituals? Do you start with the impact? And how do you move through those 3 elements? Because ideally, those all should be interwoven into how the story ends up and how the world ends up. So how do you go about weaving it all together?
So I typically, at least in this last experience, I started with beliefs. I said, okay, in my book, When the World Spoke, there's 2 primary religions. There's one, which is the Jezics, which the main characters are part of, and the second, which are the Brocklins. I initially designed them as a single religion, but then wrote it into the lore that they were the same, that then split. So it kind of takes some roots in earlier Catholicism and church splitting and stuff like that. But so I came up with some beliefs that was part of the initial religion. And then that kind of branched into, okay, here's the 2 opposing beliefs. I didn't write in practices for the second religion because I didn't have any point of view character in that aspect. But basically, I took the beliefs and I said, okay, for example, let's think. One of the big kind of things that goes on in this book with this main religion, the Jezics, is that they have all this eye imagery. So, it's all about kind of trusting in this prophet, trusting in what's gone on. And so I kind of wrote in this ceremony where they all blindfold themselves, they like do chanting, they do prayers, they engage in this sort of religious ceremony that way to kind of symbolize those beliefs that I had established. So that was a practice. And then the impacts I wrote on a more emotional level afterward. Like this character just went through this practice that kind of supported their beliefs. And so how did they feel about that? What did they see? What did they like? What kind of made them question what was going on or choose to hold stronger to what was going on? I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
You're touching on like so many of these questions. This episode's gonna be so like interwoven, I feel like. But like, how do you write a religious character? And I'm going to like, expand on this. Like, how do you write a religious character without making them a caricature of either like a zealot or like a simpleton? And this is a question that like I've been asked, so I would love to like hear your take on it.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess zealot as in fanatical and simpleton as in deceived, maybe?
Maybe not deceived, but just like not very smart. Is like this
Maybe
question comes from when I was at a writing conference and speaking at this conference on stuff like this. And an old man in the audience asked, like, all religious characters are simpletons or zealots. Why are they like that? And I was like, well, I don't think they all are, but I want to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I didn't honestly think about that when I wrote my characters. My main character, Rathal, he's the main religious character. He's part of the Jesuit order. I definitely didn't want him to come off as like a zealot. I didn't want him to come off as simpleton either. It wasn't at the forefront of my mind, but it was a thought. And so I wrote into his character kind of dynamic intelligence, I would call it. You know, he's a very smart character and he's kind of discovering these mysteries around him. So I think, you know, the other things that your religious character is doing can show that, you know, they aren't a zealot, they aren't a simpleton. And that was kind of the other piece that I also tackled with this, is that my religious character wasn't only religious. You know, he had other things that were going on. He had other qualities and other aspects that his character could be seen through.
Yeah. I love that phrase of like dynamic intelligence. I've like not heard that specific phrase before, and I love that. Like that's a good way to describe a lot of characters, I feel like. But you just said something about like making their religion more than just like one facet of their personality. How do you make a story's religion more than a side object? And you touched on this a little bit in the first answer to the first question, but do you have more to say on it?
Yeah, well, maybe just reiterating, kind of bringing it to the forefront of a character. Like I said, in a lot of fantasy I've read, there is religious aspects. You know, there is some sort of church, there is some sort of main religion, and there are some sort of practices that characters will interact with. But rarely have I seen it interact with a character on a personal and emotional level. So are they like dealing with belief struggles or faith struggles? And that kind of, again, that argument or that, maybe not argument, but discussion can bring it to the forefront of your book and make for a really interesting conversation in fantasy.
Cool. I mean, you've talked about how you kind of classify your book as a religious fantasy, and so the religion is a big part of the plot. When you're looking at a story where the religion is not necessarily the main driver of the plot or like the main object of interest for the plot action, do you have any suggestions for or things that authors can do to have it be there but still have it be rich and developed rather than just kind of a wasted side piece?
Yeah, I think that's where the practices can come heavily in. Because obviously we don't want it to be the forefront of the conversation. We really don't need to go into these conversations about faith. But if we still want it to be more than a side piece, I think having a character maybe engage in practices or see practices or even talk about practices that go on in the community with religion, and that's a way to say more than once in one chapter, hey, there's this religion, look at it, cool it is.
So you talked earlier about how the religious traditions that you've designed for When the World Spoke are, at least in the history, kind of inspired by the Protestant Reformation and about
Mm-hmm.
that split between Catholicism and Protestantism. So we would love to hear about how you strike a balance between creating original religious systems and drawing inspiration from real world religions, especially when we have these conversations about the importance of um, representation inside of media and being respectful about cultures to which we don't belong. We'd love to get your insight into that.
Yeah, so to kind of go along with that, mostly what I kind of focus on is historical religious events. Um, I am not most informed about present day religious events, so I wouldn't say that a lot of my inspiration is drawn from there. And I think it's a little easier to be respectful towards history than it is towards the present day, just because people are living in the present day. There's a lot of high emotions that maybe aren't surrounded around more academically stated topics. But to go along with your question of respect, I try to, in my writing, not present one religion as true and other as false, as believing anything as generally bad or simple, as Rin put it. Just kind of presenting the ideas, letting the character deal with them. And then if you as a reader think, oh, well, maybe it's just because in this book setting, the religion isn't real, and that's why the character has these emotions, then that's fine. Or if another reader kind of draws a different conclusion that, hey, they're just dealing with everyday common faith struggles and questions, then that's great. I think as well is kind of having characters who are multifaceted. I'm not presenting all the religious characters as angelic people. Some of them are antagonists, some of them are protagonists, as well as the people that are outside the religion. So having that kind of balance of good and bad within and without, I think shows respect as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think of it, because everyone has different experiences with religion. I know that we all grew up in the same faith tradition, but we're all in very different places in our faith journeys, just between the three of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really helpful to see those faith journeys represented in fantasy. I feel like this feeds really well into the question about in what ways can religious conflict serve as a compelling plot device in fantasy storytelling? Because we want character driven storytelling, right? So how do you incorporate religion into character driven storytelling and into a plot?
I think, at least in my experience, is kind of aligning religion with identity, which I think is actually done a lot in real life as well. So it can serve as a plot device to kind of fuel maybe disagreements, which it does in my book frequently. But also, it can maybe handle some disagreements. In a character-driven story, again, I think it's how we talked earlier about how the religion impacts the character on an individual level. For example, my main character is obviously very pro his religion. So he does a lot of things that he maybe not have done otherwise if it was an organization that wasn't so central to his identity. So it impacts his identity. He does things that maybe he wouldn't have. And then that kind of drives some change in his character because he deals with what he did.
Yeah. So how can you convey depth and complexity of religious faith in characters, especially ones where it's such a huge facet of their identity? Because I feel like sometimes I read fantasy and the religious portrayal just falls flat. How do you make sure it doesn't fall flat?
I think, well, obviously with these characters that are very focused on a religion, is not shying away from, topics of religious questioning. Again, it kind of goes back to what you said, Rin, about not making these characters simple as religious people, as not making them these people that never question anything outside their faith or inside their faith, and giving them those kind of questions. Because I think most religious people would agree that at some point in their life, whether they're still practicing or not still practicing, that they've had very large questions. And so when you read a religious character that doesn't, it just feels like it feels blind almost. And so giving them those questions, I think, solves a lot of those issues.
I love that you say it makes him blind because that feeds into your book so well. Because, like, again, I just finished like beta reading, and that feels like there's so many layers in that comment. With all the eye imagery, like, they're blind, they blindfold themselves. Like, come on. Anyways, sorry. I'm just really excited for this novel to come out. It's so good.
Me too.
Zach, do you want to take us in with another question?
Yes, I would love to. So when we are talking about religion and fantasy, and we're depicting religion and fantasy, do you have any tips for ways to, like, as far as in the prose itself, like things that you can do as the author to ease the reader into these religious themes, but also to ease them into the religious worldview that the character has, especially when you're writing inside of a first-person perspective or a third-person limited, where their personal beliefs are going to influence the way that the prose is written?
I think this is a good question, and I'm actually kind of struggling this with right now because I'm going through edits of my current book and saying, okay, how can I maybe make this clearer or make this seem more religious just from the prose itself? If I understand your question right, you're just kind of wondering, how do you use prose to influence the reader's viewpoint on religion, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. Honestly, I don't know if I have a great answer for this, though a lot of my audience is obviously coming from a Christian background, or my hopefully audience, if someone reads this book. So a lot of what I do is I'll actually go through, and this I even did more in the first book I ever wrote, which is a different draft, a different book, is I would read through famous passages of, say, the Bible, and I would try and mimic certain phraseology or different words that were used to kind of invoke those religious feelings and say, oh, this actually is very religious because the priests or the clergy or whoever it is talking in this certain way that I'm accustomed to hearing in a religious setting.
Mm-hmm.
So you draw on like historical religious texts like the Bible or maybe the Quran or the Torah. Like if you're writing from a specifically Christian background, how do you make it so your book is not just pseudo-Christianity, I guess?
That is a great question that I don't know if I have figured out all the way. I mean, obviously kind of changing some facets of the religion helps a lot. So just by not calling like the God and calling it a different name, specifically, I think like these questions about faith and about religion aren't just unique to Christianity. I imagine a lot of faiths deal with the same questions, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Jewish. So, I mean, the practices obviously kind of stem. I think if you looked at the practices in my book, you would say, okay, that's definitely like a Christian-based practice. I can see where that's coming from in the histories. But the challenges, I think, are universal, which I think is what is the focus of my book. And so that resonates more with a wider audience.
Yeah, I like that you say, like, the challenges are universal because it makes me think, like, all religion strives to ask, like, the same, like, couple questions, like, who are we, why are we here, where do we come from, where are we going?
Mm-hmm.
And, like, yeah, okay, I like that. I think you did well. And for the record, when I read your book, I did not think the Jesuits were pseudo-Christianity. I did not think that at all.
That's good, I guess.
I just wonder because I have this one very specific note in the brainstorming for my NaNoWriMo project last year where I was like, a god with like farmer shepherd imagery, but not in a Christian way. Like that is a note. It's burned into my brain. I'm still trying to figure out how to do it, and I think I focus on farmer more than shepherd.
Shepherd is very religious, yeah.
The shepherd's a very religious figure now.
Yeah.
But yeah. We are about out of time for this week one episode. So is there anything else you want to touch on about generally writing religion and fantasy? Any last questions from Zach?
I will take a last question if that works.
You know, there is a lot that is involved inside of religion. And part of the thing that makes religion so fascinating for many people is how much there is to unpack, because you can have the history, you can have the leadership, you can have the influence on social institutions. So do you have any insight into how authors can go out to, research different religions in order to gain familiarity for the kinds of things that are out there as they're creating their own religions? Because at least in constructed languages, if you only know English, all of your constructed languages are going to basically be English. But as soon as you learn another language, you can play with the aspects of both of those languages. And I feel like faith is the same way. So do you have any favorite resources that you've used to learn more about other religions, or some strategies that you would recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, obviously personal experience. I think most of my dialogue on religion comes from personal interaction. Obviously not everyone has that same level of interaction. I grew up very religious. I'm still practicing. So in a lot of ways, it's just personal experience. But in resources, in outside resources, I found the best way for me to get the most information possible was to look at foundings. So the conception of religions is the most charged with history, with practices, with legends, all of that information in such like a short time period of religion. So if you look at, the birth of Islam, or if you look at Muhammad and his journey, or if you look at kind of the birth of Christ and around that time period, so much stuff to kind of draw on and to look at. And honestly, Wikipedia, I mean, we always kind of stray away from it, but it's such a good summary. And, we want things to be accurate when we're reading them and learning them, but things are going to be changed when you're looking to put into a fantasy novel. So you can kind of use it for inspiration.
Awesome. Those were wow, what an awesome episode. I'm so excited to get this edited and put out in the world. But viewers, this has been Will Cornell talking about religion and fantasy. We'll be back next week with Will again for a deeper dive into his book, specifically When the World Spoke, and religion in that. This has been Quid Pros Quo. Thank you so much for listening.
Quid Pros Quo is hosted by DC Winters and CK Jensen. If you like this episode, be sure to leave us a rating. And if you'd like to contact us, you can email us at quidprosquo@gmail.com. For more episodes, check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts.